Hello, Environmental Policy 1 students. It's Dr. Conway back for week 11 on policy instruments and traditional regulation. This segment of the course we get into more specific policy instrument discussions, which obviously is of great importance to all environmental policy experts, whether they be in science or in the policy side of the environmental equation. It's important for you to understand, of course, that there are more than one type of policy instruments. There's a wide range, and there's a wide number of blends that you can have of policy instruments. I mean, there's obviously regulation, which most people are aware of in the environmental field, legal regulatory requirements. But there are also market-based economic instruments, voluntary approaches, information and exhortation, socializing the costs of environmental protection, and some combination of two or more of these is also possible. And it's the study of policy instruments in the area of the environment that takes up a lot of time of people who are experts in environmental policy, because we're trying to design instruments that encourage the change that we want to see to protect the environment. Now, with respect to regulation, there are also two subcategories there are subcategories of all these different policy instrument types I just talked about, but in regulation, there's typically two subcategories. One is technology or technical regulations, and one is performance-based regulations. Now, the first category, that traditionally known as traditional regulation, command and control regulation is another phrase that's often used to describe it. These regulations stipulate the technology or the processes that are required for an industry or any actor that's being regulated to comply with the stipulations of the regulations. They tend to get very specific, and they're very demanding both on the regulated and the regulator. Performance-based regulations, on the other hand, focus on the end result. They allow the regulated community to come up with the response that they need or want, including technology, process changes, whatever they need to do, to basically come up with the end result that the performance requirement stipulates, or the performance regulation stipulates. Now, they can do pretty much anything they want to comply with that performance standard, assuming that they do not transgress any other applicable regulation. So this gives firms a lot more flexibility in how they come into compliance with a regulation. And obviously in the past sort of 50 years or so, we see very few technical regulations anymore that are sort of very specific on the technology that you need to use or the process requirements that an industry or a regulated community needs to use. And instead, governments have tended to move to performance requirements, and that's for obvious reasons of enabling the industry or the regulated community to have some flexibility in how they comply, so they can do it in a relatively low-cost manner, or the most efficient and effective manner that's suitable to their particular circumstances. Technology and technical requirements became sort of challenged in the literature because they tended to put a lot of stress on rigid responses that didn't reflect the rapidity of change in markets and in technology. But they also tended to put a lot of pressure on the government regulator, because the government regulator then needed to have expertise, not only in technology of an industry, but processes of an industry. And of course, the government regulator will never have as much knowledge as the industry on these matters. And so often the regulations ended up being these ongoing negotiation processes where the government would simply not have the personnel that could keep up with the engineering and technical expertise of the industry. So there was a legitimate question as to whether we were ever achieving the objectives of the regulation because of the relative disproportionate capacity of the two actors, the regulated and the regulator. It's also the case that these technical requirements tended to become less efficient because they didn't allow the industry or the regulated community to exercise flexibility in how they came up with the performance that was the end result performance that was desired. So governments tended to switch to more towards performance-based regulations, much the way we went away from regulations being in laws and in the law that we discussed in previous weeks, to regulations being referenced by a law or a regulation drawing its authority from a framework or an umbrella law or enabling law. We now have regulations that tended to focus more on performance and less on technical standards. Now, technical regulations still do exist from the point of view of when you want to bring in a ban. Like if something is so outrageous, that it outrageously harmful, like some persistent organic pollutants like dioxins or other compounds that are extremely toxic, hazardous to the environment and public health. Those are technically just banned. I mean, they can't be used anywhere. And so in that case, and there's still bans out there, in that case, they could be described as technical regulations, because the only performance you're seeing there is that they're not used at all. Okay? And so it's important to keep these two types of regulation clear in your head as to how they work. And acknowledge that we globally, in OECD countries in particular, we've now moved largely away from technical regulations or technology requirements, more to performance-based regulations. But like I say, there are exceptions when you have bans or when you have, for example, genetically modified organisms. In other words, areas where we know the risk is so high that we don't want to tolerate any of its use, or that we are still so uncertain about what the implications of using something would be, we technically ban it in processes until we know more. And those are the cases. But usually things like air emissions, water emissions, particulate releases, things that emit VOCs, any sort of things that would be harmful to public health. We now typically set a performance standard that you can only emit so much per unit of production. Say per ton of production, there can only be this much emission of air, water, whatever. And then what happens is the government can simply assess the results of that performance, rather than trying to be technical experts or technology experts or process experts in every industry that they have to regulate, which is virtually impossible, right? So what we're primarily concerned about is what the end result is, rather than how they got there. Again, assuming no major regulatory transgression occurs in a highly related area. Now, when we assess policy instruments, and this is why we see the world, the OECD countries in particular, move from technology or technical requirements to performance requirements, is we typically assess our regulations by some key questions. I mean, does the government have the legal instruments to enable adoption of the policy instrument option? And in a lot of cases, we have clear legal authority in the performance side than we do on stipulating exactly what technology a company must buy, what techniques it must follow, what processes it must follow. The legal picture gets a lot more murky at that point, where it can be done, it has been done, it could still be done, but it's much easier to stipulate a performance requirement, tie that to a legal right to protect air, water, land, and so on, and then just ensure that everybody, regardless of the player, complies with that performance requirement. That makes the legal issues much less murky. Does the government have the technical capacity to implement the policy instrument option? Again, I just explained to you that when you try to put into place technology or technical requirements, the requirement, the capacity needs of the regulator, the government official in this case, goes up exponentially, because now you have to have technical experts with a high degree of engineering sophistication in mining, forestry, autos, chemicals. I mean, the bureaucracy becomes like huge and unwieldy with all this technical expertise that's required. Whereas you can, with performance requirements, you can have a performance measure, a monitoring measure on water quality, on air quality, on land quality that can easily be measured, and the sources of the pollution can be determined, and you can determine from that whether a company is exceeding its performance requirements. Okay, so that's why that's a major driver to going to performance requirements, as well as the industry efficiency and effectiveness side. And there's the issue of, does the government have or can it secure the financial means to implement the policy instrument option? When you were trying to do technology or technical standards, we quickly ran into limits on how much any government could afford to do, and how much, both in terms of staffing the government bureaucracy to do all this technical regulating, but also the minute you enter into a technology or technical regulation discussion with industry will obviously look to do one thing. Well, that's not the technology we were using. That's not the techniques we were using. Those were not the processes we were using. So if the government is going to force us to change on this, then we want subsidies. We want money to do that. Whereas if you allow us to meet a performance standard, we'll do it in our own mechanisms and in our own ways. Obviously, not transgressing any other regulation. But obviously the cost implications then for the regulator go way down relative to what it could be with technical regulations. And then what level of compliance can be expected from the major stakeholders, and what compliance assistance will they need? In performance requirements, they typically, large companies will typically not require a lot of financial incentive to comply, as long as they can comply within their technology, technique, and process choices, because they can act as efficiently, as effectively as possible with their environmental budget to control these emissions. Even with performance requirements, however, small or medium-sized enterprises might need technical assistance. And so governments will often use things like subsidies, tax concessions, special programs for purchasing new technology, things like that to facilitate the compliance of small and medium-sized enterprises. And again, that's always going to be less costly and more efficient and likely more effective when we do that based on performance standards rather than trying to do technological or technical or process modifications on literally thousands of small and medium-sized enterprises, which obviously quickly becomes entirely impractical, right? Particularly in modern diversified economies that have hundreds of sectors, tens of thousands of SMEs, working at different levels of competence, different markets, and so on and so forth, it becomes almost impossible to establish technical regulations in that way. And then, does the government have the capacity to ensure reasonable levels of implementation through enforcement? That's always a lot easier, the compliance, promotion, and enforcement aspect, when you're dealing with performance standards and technical standards. Because performance standards can often be measured at the gate or outside the gate, or where the company is emitting water, the industry is emitting water or air or whatever. That can be done through basic laboratory work and monitoring that you're doing in your other courses. But when you're dealing with a technology and technical standard, that requires, company inspections, technology checkups to make sure they're running, the bag house for air pollution is running properly, and all this kind of intensive scrutiny that would come into play when you're dealing with focusing on the technology, the technique, or the process instead of the end result. The complexity in the former goes up exponentially relative to the latter. So you can see all the reasons why governments have moved more to end result or performance standards rather than technology or technical standards. Okay. Now, from a business perspective, they would argue that a lot of businesses would argue that all forms of regulation impose costs on the industry that make them less competitive. Many industries would argue that. So there was a lot of competitiveness pressure to move to performance standards as well, which gave the industries more flexibility in how to respond to these environmental regulations. That would allow them to not necessarily argue as vociferously about the cost of regulation. They still do, but performance standards are intended to achieve the public goal, which is a certain level of pollution. Above that is not allowed, whereas also allowing the industry to adopt some efficiency criteria for its own needs. Now, that hasn't stopped all the brouhaha about environmental regulation and cost competitiveness. But in fact, The literature shows that the economic impact of most environmental regulation in developed countries has been relatively marginal in the whole scope of things. Other costs like labor costs, technology costs, marketing costs now far exceed the cost of most environmental regulations. But you're still, because as I've told you in previous lectures on the political economy of the environment, you're still going to get that political dynamic, that pushback, those factors. But there's also a significant component of industry that views environmental regulation, when it's well done, as to be a competitiveness enhancement relative to other countries and other industries. For example, many studies have demonstrated that many of the industries in stringent environmental control economies like Sweden, Finland, Norway, Germany, Japan have have gotten an economic bump, a competitiveness enhancement from properly designed environmental regulations. And we're seeing that in the climate change debate now. I mean, those countries that don't adopt aggressively renewable energy strategies are going to be left out of that energy economy in the future. I mean, that's clear. Okay, take with a grain of salt these either or arguments. It's bad for competitiveness or it's good for competitiveness, but rather it's usually a case of looking at the individual circumstances involved, and it is going as far as looking at the individual company involved. Some companies are in a position to adapt to environmental regulation much more efficiently than others because they kept up in other areas, or they made the right technology and process choices when they were developing their company, or whatever the case may be. So circumstances vary quite a bit. So there is no environmental regulation damages competitiveness, or environmental regulation automatically enhances competitiveness. No, these are circumstantial issues, and you need to look at the individual case for each. Okay, so so the relative strengths of the two regulations are that if you're doing something that is an outright ban, or because it's a really nasty thing and we just want to get it out of everything, and then there's there's a new and emerging technology that we just simply don't know enough about yet, and we don't want to allow a lot of use, then we could bring in some technical and technology regulations. But those types of regulations have declined a lot as the economies move to performance-based regulations, which can be measured, what they say, at the gate. In other words, if you're company A, I can determine relatively easily, without necessarily going through your plant, what you're emitting to air, what you're emitting to water, what you're emitting to land. Okay? And so these become much easier to administer. They give more flexibility to the industry, much less demanding for the regulator of that has to implement the regulation. Okay? And you can imagine then legal proceedings too, if you have to go to enforcement. Having the legal expertise to argue over a technology issue, minute technology question or technical question or process question, it's quite a bit different than having the monitoring scientists that can tell you, well, I can prove without a doubt that there's this much emission in water, air, and land, and that is exceeding the performance requirement. So there are those reasons just in compliance, promotion, and enforcement as well. So try to grasp the evolution to performance-based standards. Try to understand how we got there and why those standards typically are better. Now, next week we'll talk about market-based instruments that have a foundation in regulation, but they try to take government policy instruments more to market-based or pricing mechanisms as opposed to performance-based standards. Okay? Talk to you again next week, and have a good week. Enjoy the